In February 1994, the badly burned body of a teenager was found on an allotment in Sunderland in England. It was the third similar death in 3 months. Pathology reports gave the police no reason to treat the deaths as suspicious, but they were dealing with a sadistic serial killer.
He knew that he got sexual excitement from killing them. He knew that he wanted to destroy evidence of the strangling by setting fire to them.
The murderer was a 23-year-old man named Steven Grieveson. The papers had begun to call him the Sunderland Strangler.
He's making a decision to take someone's life time and time again. He's somebody who's chosen to do evil things, and in that way, he is a classic psychopathic serial killer.
It would take the efforts of one detective, supported by the stoic family members of Grieveson's victims, to finally bring the killer to justice.
Steven Grieveson is the most evil man I've heard of. Horrible. I just can't understand how someone could be like that.
Steven Grieveson, the Sunderland Strangler, had been revealed as one of the world's most evil killers. It was a case that almost went unsolved. For 3 months in the early 1990s, there was a serial killer on the loose in Sunderland in the northeast of England. The deaths of 3 teenagers, Thomas Kelly, David Hansen, and David Grief, were all initially believed to be mysterious but not suspicious. Pathologists had ruled out murder. It would take a new detective to finally uncover the truth and bring justice upon a 25-year-old local man named Steven Grieveson.
As the guilty verdicts were read out, there were loud cheers from the public gallery. Handing down 3 life sentences, the judge described Grieveson as evil and dangerous.
When the body of 18-year-old Thomas Kelly was found in a fire on November the 26th, 1993, the police came to the conclusion that the death was solvent-related. Local journalist Nigel Green covered the case.
I don't recall there being any great fuss after the first death. And it obviously makes you think what would have happened if Grieveson had just killed the first lad. Presumably he would have got away with it. And it would have just been dismissed as some poor lad who died glue sniffing.
It wasn't until November 1995 that Grieveson was finally charged. Nicknamed the Sunderland Strangler, he was eventually found guilty of a 4th murder at a second trial in October 2013.
I still remember this case as if it was yesterday. It's still fresh in my mind, even 20-odd years on. And I would imagine it's still similar for the other people of Sunderland.
This killer's story begins over 45 years ago. Steven Grieveson was born in Sunderland on the 14th of December 1970. He grew up in a large family, and his parents were reportedly violent towards one another.
You are molded by the environment you live in. It's a fact, everybody knows this. So if you grow up with violence, you tend to be more violent than people that don't.
Grieveson appears to show some psychopathic traits in childhood. Some of his old school reports are looked at by a psychologist at his trial, and within these reports they talk of his lack of empathy, about his callousness, about his real lack of emotion towards other people. I think there are a few red flags in Steven Grieveson's childhood, but they're not necessarily red flags that say to me, this person's going to turn into a murderer. They're red flags that say this is somebody who perhaps needs some help, needs some support, later on in childhood and in their teenage years.
Growing up, Grieveson was often in trouble, and in 1982, he was arrested for shoplifting.
He opened a packet of nails inside a shop. He didn't take the whole pack. He took 1 nail, and he got caught. And obviously the owner of the shop didn't like that very much, and he actually went to court for stealing one nail. One nail, not a pack of nails, the one nail. But he was only 11 years old.
Extraordinarily, he was taken in front of the magistrate. Now, for most 11-year-old boys, that would be the most terrifying experience imaginable. And they would certainly not dream of doing it again, even though it was, in many ways, absolutely irrelevant, tiny crime, certainly not punishable by anything significant. But it's interesting that Grieveson didn't take that experience as any kind of lesson. He simply brushed it off, water off a duck's back. He simply went on and did what he wanted to do.
At the age of 13, social services made the decision to remove Grieveson from the family home.
Well, when he was an adolescent, he was taken into the residential care system and he ends up at a children's home in Carlisle.
Grieveson's troubles continued through his adolescence.
He's had a real sense of shame instilled in himself at this point in his life. This is a point where many people are realizing things about their sexuality, experimenting with their sexuality, and at the same time when people should have the freedom to do that, he's been experiencing abuse and violence and neglect, and all of this is fueling a sense of shame.
Grieveson struggled with his homosexuality in an environment designed to quash it.
I think the context of the 1970s, 1980s Northeast is another factor in the Steven Grieveson story. This is an area of tough working class masculinity, of mining, of shipbuilding, of those kind of jobs that make men masculine men. So there'll be very much a culture of what a man should look like, how a man should behave. And for Steven Grieveson, for somebody who realises that he's gay, this is another way in which he's not going to fit in, he's not going to be accepted.
People that grew up in an environment where it's a macho environment, it's like, oh no, you have to be a man. If you were born a man, you have to be a man, you have to play football, you have to do this, you have to go out and drink with the lads. Suddenly you start having all these, affection or feelings for another male. It's a very common thing for people to be a little bit ashamed and go, what's going on? This cannot be, and they will lie to themselves. And I'm pretty sure that's exactly what happened with Grieveson.
Grieveson didn't fit into the world around him, and by the age of 19, he'd become a social outcast.
By 1990, Steven Grieveson had been convicted of around about 38 different offences. So he was in and out of prison, and it's this very typical revolving door that we see with kind of low-level crime, property crime. It's a way of life for some people.
In May of the same year, 1990, Sunderland was rocked by the murder of a 14-year-old boy called Simon Martin. He'd been found semi-naked and bludgeoned to death in a derelict building after running away from home just days before.
I remember the Simon Martin murder very well. We had 5 murders in less than a week in Sunderland. And in hindsight, looking back, whether that was putting extra pressure on the police with a given murder inquiry involving 40, 50 police officers, a hell of a lot of police resources, and whether that would have put strain on the Simon Martin murder at the time.
The police initially thought they had quickly solved the crime after arresting a local teenager.
He was 16, he lived nearby. He was a respectable lad from a good family from memory, and he'd been playing in that building with others, and they found his fingerprints in the building. There was blood in the building as well, and they found his fingerprint in blood, which was just coincidence.
All charges against the 16-year-old boy were eventually dropped. The murder of Simon Martin would remain unsolved for 23 years. But during the original investigation in May 1990, police had also spoken to a local 19-year-old man named Steven Grieveson.
He's somebody who had a reputation in the local area for hanging around with people younger than him. And I think when you've got somebody who's trying to get a sense of control, get a sense of power, you often feel that they hang around with people who they see as slightly inferior to them.
Grieveson was questioned by the police in the wake of Simon Martin's body being discovered. And Grieveson said, yes, I saw him, but he was fine when I left him.
Grieveson was released without charge. 3 years later, the discovery of the body of 18-year-old Thomas Kelly would trigger a series of similar deaths that would spread fear across the whole of Sunderland. By the winter of 1993, 22-year-old Steven Grieveson had built up a reputation as a troublemaker. In November of the same year, Thomas Kelly, an 18-year-old student, had gone missing from the family home he shared with his parents and his sister, Lindsay.
My brother Thomas was just a normal boy for the time, just kind, helpful. He would do anything for anybody. Loved life. We wouldn't go to bed on a night time without saying we loved each other. He used to call me Pins instead of Lins, which was a bit strange, but that was the way we went on. We argued quite a bit, as brother and sister do, but never went to bed without making up. We were very close as brother and sister. We were close as a family. We didn't have loads of money or nothing like that, but we went out and done things together. Silly things like willock picking and, you know, we just... very close family, I'd say.
Lindsay vividly remembers the day her older brother disappeared.
I went to school, my mum went to work, and then Thomas had left for college. And that was the last time we'd seen him. It was actually a bit strange that morning because we were very close as brother and sister. But that morning he was standing by the fireplace in my mum's house, and as we said bye, he walked forward and grabbed my hand and squeezed my hand.
On November the 26th, 1993, the emergency services were called to a burning shed on an allotment near Monkwearmouth Hospital in Sunderland.
The fire attracts attention inevitably, and the body of Thomas Kelly is found. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like for whoever arrived on that allotment to confront the sight of a burning body in a burning building. It is gruesome.
When I came on the news, I wasn't listening to the news, and I was sitting in the house, and I'd seen my dad cover his face. And I went, what's wrong? And he went, there's a body being found. And they say parents get a feeling. I don't know where they go feeling at that point.
Thomas's badly burnt body had seemingly destroyed any possible evidence, and senior detectives at Northumbria Police were not convinced that he had been murdered.
They were treating it as mysterious but not suspicious. They didn't quite know what had went on with Thomas. We had told them that everything was out of the ordinary. Thomas wouldn't be in an allotment like that or a place like that normally, unless he'd went with somebody.
Drug and solvent abuse were prevalent in working-class areas at the time, and detectives were keeping an open mind.
It's very hard for the police at that point to know quite what had been going on. Solvent was found in the area, but they weren't certain.
I think there was a real stigmatisation of young men in this area during the 1980s, the 1990s. It was a period of industrial decline. There were a lot of social problems often in some of the deprived communities in this part of the UK. So it was very easy to attach a particular story to a situation.
Initial pathology reports on Thomas's body were also inconclusive.
The question is whether the death's suspicious or not. In the era when solvent abuse was common, young lads found dead in an allotment, evidence of fire. If you're not thinking dirty, you're not seeing what it may be. It's the initial assessment, and if that misses what it's likely to be, then the whole investigation goes down the wrong route.
And that's exactly what happened. Because of a lack of pathological evidence, the police had ruled out murder, but they were wrong. Thomas Kelly had been strangled to death with his own bandana after bumping into a local 22-year-old man named Steven Grieveson.
I think they probably knew each other, or at least met, perhaps at football.
Grieveson reportedly revealed his homosexuality to Thomas Kelly, and it is assumed that he killed the 18-year-old to cover his secret.
He then decides to burn Kelly's body in an effort to disguise what has gone on. It is merciless. It is without possible explanation. Why would you set fire to the body of a boy unless within you there is some kind of lack of conscience? Or it is a monstrous act. There's no two ways about it.
Detectives had questioned known troublemaker Grieveson about Thomas Kelly's death, but they had no reason to arrest him. It was a grave mistake.
Thomas Kelly was killed at the end of November. By early February, just literally a few weeks later, he'd abducted or persuaded another young man called David Hansen to go with him to a derelict building.
On February the 4th, 1994, Grieveson strangled the life from 15-year-old David Hansen before setting his body alight. Once again, he was questioned about the death, but released without charge.
So now Grieveson's starting to be calculating. He starts to realize that he can actually get away with things by getting rid of the evidence. By burning the victim, he'll get rid of all the circumstantial evidence and all the evidence that he could have left on the body.
With another inconclusive report from a different pathologist, detectives ruled that David Hansen had not been murdered, despite the similarities between his and Thomas Kelly's death 6 weeks earlier.
I remember speaking to one police contact on the case, telling me that it didn't add up that it was murder, and it didn't add up that it was solvents. I didn't get into the precise details of why that was, but I remember him telling me that, as I say, the first one was just deemed to be a tragedy. The second one was deemed to be a coincidence. And officers said to each other at the time, as long as we don't get a third one, and they did get a third one.
Just a few weeks later, the end of February '94, Grieveson persuades another boy, David Grief, also 15, to go to another allotment. Grieveson kills him, strangles him, and does set fire to him again. Grieveson has now killed 3 young men in the space of literally 3 months.
Steven Grieveson is escalating his offending, and for somebody with psychopathic traits, it's not unusual for them to get bored easily, and that applies to their offending as it does to their life in general. They've got a need for stimulation, they've got a need to up the ante and experience that kind of thrill again and again.
I don't know, I look back on it, and I sometimes wonder if Grieveson had some kind of almost desire to see how far he could push it without being caught. It's hard to say, it's speculation, but it seems, strange use of words, almost reckless from a killer's point of view to repeat a similar murder in a similar area for a third time.
The police spoke to Steven Grieveson for a third time, and for a third time they let him go without charge, much to the frustration of the families of the 3 deceased teenagers.
Steven Grieveson was interviewed. We didn't know this at the time, because the police were saying that it was drug abuse. It was afterwards that we realised that he was arrested and interviewed at the police station, only later to be let out and murder again.
Well, I think Steven Grieveson felt absolutely invincible. He was picked up by the police after each of these boys' deaths, but they didn't connect him to the actual murders until much later. So it really did kind of shore up a sense in which he felt, I can do this again, because the police have talked to me, they clearly haven't joined up the dots, I'm getting away with this. So he feels absolutely invincible.
But less than a month after the death of David Grieveson was finally in police custody. He was arrested and charged with robbery after forcing staff at a local fish and chip shop to empty the till. Although sentenced to 18 months in prison, investigators still weren't considering charging Grieveson with murder because 3 reports from 3 different pathologists had failed to link the deaths. All of them were being treated as solvent-related.
We didn't understand where the idea of drugs came from. There was no evidence on any of the boys to say that they'd taken anything. No matter what the families were saying and telling the police of what these boys were like, it felt like no one was listening. People were grabbing hold of a story that wasn't true. And I think to drag 3 boys' names down, it was awful. It was just, they didn't deserve it. They didn't deserve it, and they only had us to defend them, that they weren't here to defend themselves.
Even at the time, you could look back and think the police should have looked on that as being suspicious that they were apparently hallucinogens and the fires. They should have realised from day one there was something not right.
But time was running out for Grieveson. Investigators believed the deaths were suspicious, but so far no one had been charged with murder. The families of the victims were far from satisfied.
I think before the 3 families had met up and got together, we were all fighting from separate corners. We wouldn't let anything lie. We were trying to get information from everywhere. And I think when the families did come together, the police knew that we were a stronger force and we weren't going to back down. Didn't matter what, we knew that these boys were murdered.
By the time of the 3rd death, the families were starting to kick up a fuss, and the media were quite rightly paying attention. One of my colleagues, Paul Watson, went down to see the families, and I remember him coming back quite vociferous that there was something in what they were saying, because obviously there could be a cynical approach that the families of glue sniffers are going to try and make it look like their sons hadn't got involved in that kind of thing, and there was some more to it. But he came back very convinced. I also went out to see the families, and I remember coming away thinking, yes, what they say, there is something definitely in what they say, that way too much coincidence, way too many things that were wrong.
Months passed as the families and local press continued to pressure the police to change course.
You've got to look at the sheer weight of the pressure that the families brought, the campaigning that they did, that they were convinced from day one there was something not right about it.
All the families of the victims were really close. We needed each other. We stuck together, and that's what we needed. We were no one alone, but to have those people who understood what you were going through around you made a difference.
Finally, the families got their wish. A new detective, Dave Wilson, had taken over the case. He wanted to re-examine the evidence gathered by 3 separate pathologists.
Some causes of death are simply more difficult to identify than others, particularly if there's been post-mortem changes in the bodies. Pathologists are human. People make mistakes. What you need is a new person, a new way of thinking, like the officer David Wilson in this case, who comes in and says, what about thinking about it differently? What about these factors? Let's look at it again. And that's the sort of thing that can often just kickstart an investigation into the right frame of mind.
Dave Wilson was a different person altogether, a different detective. He wanted to find out what happened. He thought, could there be a sexual motive? Which it would have been looked in straight away if there were girls who had been murdered. And he went down that route, and it really helped. We felt like someone was listening to us and someone was fighting with us rather than against us. You could see David Wilson, he was hungry to get this person off the streets and get this person convicted. He wasn't going to just lie back and leave it. He was looking into everything again. He looked into the boys, he looked into all the evidence, and he wasn't going to give up until he got his man.
Detective Wilson was certain that all 3 deaths were linked. Not only were the crime scenes extremely similar, all 3 boys had attended the same school, Monk Wearmouth Comprehensive. In August 1994, Wilson asked for a second post-mortem to be carried out on all the bodies by a senior pathologist.
You don't just call a friend and say, can you re-examine the body? No, you have to get, court orders and judges and everybody involved. And this detective was relentless. He went after it and he got the court order that was needed. This is a detective that he knew that something was wrong. When you read a case and maybe it's a gut feeling or there's something there, you go, okay, this cannot be like this.
On closer inspection, all 3 teenagers appeared to have died in the same way.
So in Grieveson's case, the most important factor was that the ligature marks are then identified. We're now moving from 3 similar but apparently discrete incidents, albeit involving 3 young boys from the same school, to 3 potential homicides from the same school the same way. Now you're almost looking towards a serial killer.
I think that the fact that Steven Grieveson killed his victims via strangulation is very significant because it's one of the most personal forms of killing. You are watching the life drain out of them. He's probably feeling more in control at the time he's killing his victims than he's ever felt at any point in his life before. So I think it's a very deliberate choice of method.
I think they were groomed, encouraged, cajoled, or perhaps even threatened by Grieveson. And they paid the price with their lives.
I remember the day very well. I was on the Sun when Northumbria Police revealed that they were treating the deaths as murder. And tragic as it was, the family would have seen that as a victory, that finally something was happening.
Detectives had found fingerprints and a footprint belonging to Grieveson in the derelict house where David Hansen was murdered. They were from a burglary Grieveson had committed months before, but proved he had access to the property. And by September 1994, Wilson had retrieved some conclusive evidence. Semen found in the stomach of the 3rd victim, 15-year-old David Grief, was a DNA match for Steven Grieveson.
If you burn the outside of the body, then you can lose injuries. If you lose the skin and the soft tissues beneath it, there's going to be less and less that you can see. But it can be surprising what you can still identify, particularly if the area is protected from the fire. You can still see maybe stab wounds. You can see all sorts of things that many people who try to dispose of a body by fire think will be gone.
Grieveson was already in prison for robbery after holding up a fish and chip shop.
Steven Grieveson was a bully. He wasn't nice. He used to go around picking on lads and taking stuff off them. He picked on teenage boys, old women, anybody that was smaller than him, I think. He was a troublemaker. Someone to keep away from. When Grieveson was arrested for the murder, we weren't shocked at all, because it was what we were fighting for months. We knew it was him. We knew that those boys had done nothing wrong. We knew that someone had done that to them.
Grieveson's trial was set for January 1996. He was going to plead not guilty to the murders of Thomas Kelly, David Hansen, and David Grief.
I think Steven Grieveson maintained his innocence for quite a while initially, because he thought that he was going to get away with it, because he'd come onto the police radar several times and had gone off it again. And now he finds himself charged with these murders. I think he's just chancing it. I think he's just pleading not guilty and saying I'm not responsible, because he thinks there is actually a chance that he's going to get away with this.
He is a man who wishes to conceal the darkness in his soul and will go to any lengths to do so. He absolutely refuses to accept that he could have played any part in the deaths of these 3 innocent young men, and fronts that lie without any possible flicker of doubt throughout his 6-week trial.
The parents of the 3 murdered teenagers arriving at court, where today they listened to details of how, according to the prosecution, their sons were killed.
During the trial at Leeds Crown Court, Grieveson showed complete contempt for the families of his victims.
I was 17, I think, at the time. And it was a hard thing to take in. Not just for me, for all the families. None of us were used to being in a court surroundings or anything like that. We didn't know what normally went on in court. What made it worse was Grieveson sat in the dock, sticking his fingers up at us, just goading us, pulling faces, laughing at us. It wasn't nice.
The evidence against Grieveson was compelling. He had left prints at the house where David Hanson was murdered and his DNA on the body of David Grief. The jury took just 4 hours to find him guilty.
When Steven Grieveson got convicted, we all erupted. The public gallery, the family, everyone had jumped up off the seat. We didn't think that we were going to get him because of the lack of evidence on some of the boys. And when he got convicted of Thomas first, we knew that he would get convicted of the other 2.
On February the 28th, 1996, Judge Mr. Justice Holland described Grieveson as plain evil as he handed out 3 life sentences to the 25-year-old. He was sent to Full Sutton Prison in Yorkshire.
I mean, nothing is going to bring these poor lads back, and the pain is going to be with the families forever. But at least in finding out what happened to the sons and finding out that they weren't just glue sniffers who died in a burning building, that they were innocent victims of a serial killer, and the truth finally coming out would hopefully alleviate some of the pain for the families.
In December 1997, Northumbria police apologised to the families of the 3 boys for the distress caused to them during the initial investigation.
I think if the police had done a better job and looked into this properly, maybe listened more to the families about what kind of boys they were, they would have took them off the streets a lot earlier and maybe could have saved a lot of lives.
But the police weren't done with Steven Grieveson just yet. Northumbria police were convinced that he was also responsible for a death that preceded all of his other victims, the murder of Simon Martin in May 1990. The body of the 14-year-old schoolboy had been found half naked in a derelict house.
Grieveson clearly decided that he didn't want this little boy to tell anyone what had happened. And so he decided that he would silence him. And he hit Simon Martin with some of the rubble in the house, persistently around the head. Later, he was to claim, "I just flipped." No, Grieveson didn't just flip. He decided that he didn't want anyone to know what had happened, and the easiest way of doing that was to kill the boy, because he couldn't tell anyone, therefore. This was a little boy who was being killed to keep him quiet.
However, the murder didn't match Grieveson's usual MO.
Simon Martin was not strangled to death by Grieveson, nor was he set on fire. But at the time of Simon's killing in 1990, when Grieveson was only 19 and a half, he hadn't yet refined the method that he wanted to use to kill. He was still working out in his own mind, I suspect, what gave him the most satisfaction. Martin was, if you like, a prototype. Kelly, Hanson and Grief were the finished article.
Simon's murder predated the others by 3 years.
I think the thing that I'd say with this case is that we have quite a significant gap between 1990 and 1993. I'd be really interested to know what Steven Grieveson was doing during that time period, because often when somebody commits a murder and enjoys committing a murder, they often don't wait years until they commit another one. So that gap is quite a problem for me.
Just as before, Detective Dave Wilson had re-examined Simon's case and discovered some DNA belonging to Grieveson at the scene of the murder. In November 2000, he was arrested in his cell at Full Sutton Prison and questioned by detectives.
There's no doubt that he had attacked and killed Simon Martin. Grieveson denies any knowledge of it, flatly refuses to say anything.
Without a confession, the police decided they couldn't charge Grieveson with Simon's murder.
Serial killers keep secrets because it gives them power, and it also gives them power to torment the families of their victims. Simon Martin's father, who'd been in the army, launched a great appeal to find his missing son. These were real, ordinary, decent people whom Grieveson took inordinate pleasure in tormenting.
But over a decade later, out of the blue, Grieveson finally confessed. In a series of interviews with detectives in February 2013, he admitted that he was responsible for Simon Martin's death. But he still denied murdering the 14-year-old schoolboy.
When we found out that Grieveson had admitted to killing Simon Martin, none of us were surprised. We always knew. And we always wanted justice for Simon, as well as ourselves.
So Steven Grieveson said that he was haunted about Simon. This is something that had troubled him during his time in prison. And all of this apparently from a man with no conscience, with very little empathy for other people, somebody with significant psychopathic traits. I'd be quite cautious about this statement, because it suggests to us, doesn't it, that he has some empathy, that he has some remorse, that he's feeling bad. But this is somebody who's been in prison for a significant amount of time. He's been learning about other people's emotions while he's been in prison. He's been learning what other people want to hear, what they need to hear, and also the kind of things that you need to say to make your own situation better. So I'd be cautious about attaching any real meaning to that.
On the 14th of October 2013, at Newcastle Crown Court, Grieveson was back in the dock, charged with a fourth murder that had taken place 23 years beforehand.
When the Simon Martin trial came up, we all went to court every day, the same as we did the first time. Stuck together as the three families, or the four families, which it had become. It was just as hard as the first trial. We learnt a lot of stuff about our boys that we got told wrongly at the beginning. There's lots of stuff that we didn't know came out. So it was very hard, it was difficult.
The jury did not believe that Simon's death was an accident, and on October the 24th, 2013, Grieveson was found guilty of murder.
It was good news. It was good news for Sunderland. It was good news for the family that this unsolved murder could finally be laid to rest, and that would ease some of the pain, not only for the family of Simon Martin, but also for the family of the boy who was wrongly arrested and wrongly charged with the killing.
It was revealed during the second trial that Grieveson had written to all three families of his initial victims asking for forgiveness. In extracts from a letter to the family of Thomas Kelly, he wrote, "I know you think I am evil, horrible. I should never have done what I did. I never ever intended to take Thomas away from you. I am sorry I destroyed your son's life, your family's life. I wish I could turn the clock back. I hope one day you will find it in both of your hearts to forgive me."
Those letters meant nothing to me. Nothing at all. And I think he wrote them to wind us up. It was his way of getting to us again.
There are several levels of psychopath. The top level is when you have zero emotions. There's other levels that you will have certain emotions but not other emotions towards people. But in his case, one thing I have seen in other psychopaths, in people that have been to prison, is that they like the limelight. And once the limelight starts to die down, they'll find something else to bring the limelight. So it could have been that that's the reason why he wrote the letters.
Irrespective of his motive for writing the letters of forgiveness, nothing will bring back the 4 boys who Grieveson heartlessly murdered.
I think about Thomas every day, many times in that day. He's always on my mind and he's always there. It's probably the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I think about when I go to sleep. It doesn't just go away. It doesn't. It's hard.
The man who brought Grieveson to justice, Detective Superintendent Dave Wilson, passed away in 2011. He was 64 years old. The shadow of the Sunderland Strangler still looms over the city today. A man who killed young boys just to keep them quiet.
Many people struggle with their sexuality, but very few of them are going to go on and harm other people, let alone kill them. I think in the case of Steven Grieveson, what we've got is a unique, toxic combination of factors. We've got a disruptive childhood. We've got a lack of acceptance within a community. So we've got all of these things coming together to almost create the perfect storm. It's a horrible way of describing it, but that's what we have in this case.
I look back on it now and I thank God that the families did do what they did, and that the media and the journalists at the time did what they did and really pushed for the truth to come out.
We will never forgive Steven Grieveson. Never forgive him. He's hurt us too much. And to be honest, if I was to find out if he died in prison tomorrow, wouldn't bother us one bit.
Grieveson was a troubled man with a troubled childhood. But this can be no excuse for callously taking the life of 4 young boys. His capture was all down to the passion and hard work of a detective spurred on by the victims' families. Together, they finally brought about the downfall of Steven Grieveson, one of the world's most evil killers. December 1988, Kansas City. Robert Berdella finally confessed to kidnapping, raping, torturing and then killing 6 men, 4.5 years after the murder of his first victim.
To him, they weren't living, feeling, breathing individuals. They were literally just pieces of meat, and he would do with them what he wanted.
He took hundreds of photos and kept vivid, detailed notes to document his macabre acts, using ever-increasing twisted methods to cause unimaginable pain and suffering.
This was not a spree killing. This was not somebody out of control of their actions. This is somebody who knows what he's doing, knows what he wants to do, and does it. That is the definition of evil.
After murdering them, he dissected his victims with such precision, he became known as the Kansas City Butcher.
And then he would cut the bodies up with a butcher knife and a chainsaw, and then put them in the trash.
His dark fantasies, sick mind and horrific torture of 6 men that sometimes lasted weeks at a time makes Robert Berdella one of the world's most evil killers. April the 2nd, 1988, Kansas City, Missouri. A man wearing nothing but a dog collar was found in the street. He was taken to a house nearby where he pled for police to be called. A police investigation revealed a horrific series of murders that took place at the hands of one man who systematically and methodically kidnapped and tortured young, vulnerable men before killing them.
Berdella is evil because he took advantage of the weak and he just performed so many unpleasant acts on them while they were alive.
For Berdella, it's more than just killing, it's cruelty.
After claiming his first victim in 1984, he went on to murder 5 more men, each time increasing the level of pain and suffering that he caused them.
Berdella had a complete disregard for human life, and I think what he was always aiming for was to create this compliant, docile sex slave. And some of his victims, he treated them so brutally that they died as a result of the torture, as a result of him trying to deprive them of all of their sensations.
Rick Holtzclaw was the assistant prosecutor for the sex crimes unit in Kansas City.
We would prey on those who were down and out or needed some help. He would befriend them or take them in, and that's how it would begin.
Berdella's crimes would go unnoticed for years, until one day one of his victims managed to escape and call for help. Troy Cole was the lead detective on the case.
We decided to bring in a backhoe to dig up that one particular spot where it looked like it might have had a grave marker to it. And sure enough, on the second scoop of the backhoe, it pulled up a human head. And that was the first time that I realized we had a homicide investigation, and it was probably going to be a big investigation.
Until this point, Berdella was seen as an upstanding member of the local community. Roy Orth was a sergeant with the Kansas City Police Department.
Robert Berdella was a member of the arts community in Kansas City, Missouri, a former student of the Kansas City Art Institute. He was involved in his neighborhood crime watch program, and as I remember, was even a court-appointed advocate for juveniles through the Kansas City, Missouri juvenile justice system.
This seemingly normal member of the Kansas City community went from being an upstanding citizen to an infamous serial killer.
Berdella documented the torture and the murder of his victims for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, he wanted to relive and revisit that sense of power he felt when he was doing these things. But secondly, he wanted to create an archive. I think he wanted history to remember him and remember the horrendous things that he'd done.
This killer's story begins in 1949. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. was born on January the 31st, the first of 2 sons. He was raised in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, in a strict Catholic household.
His father worked at the Ford Motor Company. His mother was a homemaker, so they were very much the traditional American nuclear family.
Berdella was a shy, intelligent child who struggled to fit in at school.
He was bullied by his peers because he did stand out as different. He wore very thick glasses. He went to the algebra club. He collected stamps. So there was that sense in which he always felt that isolation from his peer group.
Then, in his mid-teens, his world was turned upside down.
Berdella's father died of a heart attack when he was 16, and this did have quite a significant impact on him because his mother remarried and she went on to set up another home with somebody else. And I think that Berdella really did feel a sense of rejection here. He was part of his mother's past. The world had moved on and he was left behind.
Around the same time, Berdella had been working part-time.
There's a particular incident that Berdella later recalls that is potentially significant. Berdella claims that he was raped when he was an adolescent at a restaurant where he worked.
Berdella never reported the incident to the police. In 1967, after graduating high school, Berdella enrolled in Kansas City Art Institute. At this time, he'd begun exploring his sexuality.
He'd realized that he was certainly gay, and it was pretty apparent to him that his father would not have approved of that.
He's also been brought up in the Catholic Church, so I think there is very much an underlying sense of shame there.
By 1969, Berdella had begun to experiment with drugs. He quit college after tutors failed to understand his twisted art projects, often involving live animals.
He may have been a bit nerdy to look at, and a bit strange, but he was clearly talented.
In need of a job, Berdella put his talents to a new use.
Berdella started working as a short-order chef and quickly rose.
He developed quite a good reputation in the local community as people were talking about the food that he was making. And he bought his own house. He had quite a bright future. He really was a figure that commanded respect in the local community.
By his mid to late 20s, Berdella had also developed a passion for collecting, and this hobby soon became a business in its own right.
He was obviously a very good chef, but it wasn't his only talent. He also collected art and antiquities. This was a man of quite considerable taste, working at some of the best restaurants and at the same time operating a boutique called Bob's Bazaar, selling art and antiquities.
The boutique became Berdella's full-time job, and he began to rent out rooms in his home to help make ends meet. Some of those lodgers were vulnerable young men who'd receive bed and board in return for carrying out jobs around the house and at his antique shop.
People who'd run away from home, young gay men, couples, rather a sort of benevolent figure. As far as the local community concerned, an entirely upright and straightforward citizen.
In 1984, Berdella's behaviour began to get bizarre.
His house had become literally a warehouse of all sorts of odd objects. This man, who previously had been a sort of pillar of the local community, was becoming increasingly odd. And he also, I think, began to despise the young men who came seeking shelter.
In March that year, aged 35, Berdella began a relationship with a 19-year-old male former sex worker, Jerry Howell.
Berdella knew his dad, who also had a stall in the flea market. So Jerry hung around with his dad, so Berdella knew both of them well.
Jerry had had some issues with drugs. He'd had some issues with the criminal justice system. And I think Berdella was seen to be this trusted figure. So when Berdella offers to help him, he offers to lend him money. Jerry takes him up on this. He doesn't pay him back, though.
On July the 5th, 1984, he picked Jerry up from the flea market to help with some jobs. But Jerry was more interested in getting loaded. Berdella gave him drugs and alcohol, and they headed home. But getting increasingly frustrated with Jerry using him, Berdella gave Jerry some stronger medication that caused him to pass out.
When the victim became virtually unconscious, Berdella would inject him with drugs, giving him absolute control over the body. He would then repeatedly rape the victim over a very extended period, in this case, 27 hours.
When he returned from work, the torturing continued.
He's not only sexually assaulted, he is struck with a metal ruler, he's given a cocktail of drugs before he's even killed. So we have a mixture of somebody who's going to be confused by what's going on, they're going to be confused by the drugs they've been given, and then he's being physically and sexually assaulted. It's just a horrific way to die.
The following night, Jerry was dead. Berdella had meticulously detailed the torture and murder in extensive notes and photographs.
One of the things that Berdella did immediately after Jerry had died was to note down and describe precisely what he did with the body, which effectively was to drain it of blood and then dismember it and wrap it up in garbage bags. He kept a detailed record because, in many ways, that was the kind of character that he was. He took pride in his work. He was completely cold and isolated, interested only in his own satisfaction, which makes it all the more chilling.
Berdella bagged up the remains with all the instruments he'd used and dumped it in the trash, which was picked up the next morning. On July the 8th, Jerry's father contacted the police.
Jerry's father reports him missing, and Berdella is interviewed by the police in relation to this. And Berdella says, well, I dropped him off at the 7-Eleven, the convenience store. And at this point in time, why wouldn't the police believe Berdella? He's this upstanding figure in the community. He's not somebody who would appear to have a reason to lie. So unfortunately, this case goes cold.
Then officers received a tip-off from one of Berdella's previous boarders, Todd.
One of Jerry's acquaintances, who was also known to Berdella, actually tipped off the police that they thought that Berdella may have been involved, or at least given Jerry a hotshot injection. But there was no body. Nobody knew where Jerry was.
Berdella was put under surveillance, but no evidence was ever found.
Jerry Howell's father always thought that Berdella had done something to his kid. He just couldn't prove it. And but yes, he was very suspicious of him.
Jerry Howell's body was never discovered. Berdella had developed a sick taste for torture and murder, and after getting away with his first crime, he began to look for ever-increasing, horrific ways to get his sexual kicks. 9 months after he tortured and murdered his first victim, 19-year-old Jerry Howell, Robert Berdella took his next victim.
So Robert Sheldon was somebody who had stayed with Berdella before at his house. So there was a degree of trust in this relationship, and it was trust that Berdella really did take advantage of.
On April the 10th, 20-year-old drug addict Robert Sheldon appeared at Berdella's door looking for somewhere to stay after an argument with his girlfriend. Shortly after he set foot inside, Berdella put his sadistic plan into action.
He keeps him for 4 days. Automatically, you know that this is going to be somebody who's in distress. He starts to escalate his cruelty with this victim. He injects drain cleaner into his eyes. He fills his ears with caulking material. There's damage to the hands from piano wire. He's hitting him with a rubber mallet. All of these things are acts of cruelty, and they would not kill you. It's subduing the victim.
He did some horrendous things to him, but the thing that really stood out for me was the tattoo that he gave this victim on his shoulder. He was almost branding this man, saying, "You are mine, I own you and I possess you."
Like he had with his first victim, Berdella documented his methods by writing intricate notes. This time he went one step further and included himself in the photographs with his tormented victim.
He wanted an absolute record of everything he'd done. It was a certain amount of pride. There is no doubt whatever that that's what was in his mind. He documented it because he was proud of it.
On the 14th of April, Berdella arrived home to find a workman he knew on the roof of his property. Concerned that he'd be discovered, he decided to kill Robert.
He becomes quite paranoid because he knows this guy. So Berdella takes matters into his own hands and he goes and places a plastic bag over the head of his victim, essentially ending his life.
Berdella began his ritual act of cutting up his victim's body piece by piece.
Dismembering a body is not the easiest thing in the world to do, but if you have some knowledge, like a surgeon or a chef, then you can quite effectively dismember a body, and that makes it easier to dispose of.
This horrific expertise in chopping up bodies later earned Berdella the nickname the Kansas City Butcher. In keeping with his obsession with collecting, this time Berdella decided he wanted to keep a souvenir of his actions.
Berdella's second victim, Robert, he dismembered the body and cut off the head. But this time he didn't put it all into black garbage bags and put it out for the garbage truck. He kept the head first in the freezer in his house, and he later buried it in the garden where it decomposed as a kind of trophy of the killing.
And this is really significant for me because the head is what gives somebody their identity. It's what makes them a human. I think by keeping the head, Berdella wants to be able to say, I'm the one that has depersonalized this individual. I'm the one that's dehumanized them.
Berdella had now tortured and murdered 2 people without being caught. The following June, just 2 months after his last murder, he struck again.
Mark was a young man who had helped out around Berdella's house. He'd mown the lawn for him a few times, and Berdella discovered him intoxicated in his shed one day. He invites him into his home, and so begins the process of torture, as had been the case with previous victims.
20-year-old Mark Wallace was gagged and injected with a cocktail of drugs to sedate him before he was restrained and raped.
Mark was Berdella's third victim. And again, I think we have with this the escalation and the experimentation. We have injection of drugs. He's used the rubber mallet again to strike his victim, but now he's applying electric shocks.
When Berdella returned from work that evening, he found Mark trying to free himself. Berdella sedated him again before continuing to rape and torture his victim.
It's almost as if he has a compliant victim and he's thinking, what will this do? Electric shocks are rarely fatal, but they can be tremendously painful.
As had become his custom, Berdella kept a record of his barbaric actions in his diary. On the 23rd of June 1985, he wrote, 7 a.m., no signs of life.
He died as a result of the torture. And in previous cases, we've seen this happen before.
Once again, Berdella lived up to his alter ego of the Kansas City butcher.
He's dismembered with a safety razor, a knife and a saw, and then literally left out with the rubbish.
With 3 local men now missing, rumors amongst Kansas City sex workers began to spread.
The male sex workers of Kansas City had developed quite a wariness of Robert Berdella. He'd developed something of a reputation at this time for being aggressive with people, for wanting to tie them up, wanting to aggressively rape them. So there was definitely a sense in which this guy was somebody to steer clear of. This guy was potentially dangerous.
Berdella was well known for haunting what you might describe as gay bars, as the gay community, but he was also very well known for wanting to be in complete control. He did not have a good reputation, and many of the people that came into contact with him warned each other in that really quite small community.
Despite his reputation, some still trusted him. On the 26th of September 1985, Walter Ferris, a married man and acquaintance of Berdella, turned up at his house. Once he set foot inside, his fate was sealed.
Walter asked Berdella whether he could stay at his house, and I think in this, Berdella sees another opportunity, and so begins a process again of torture and of absolutely horrendous pain and discomfort.
Berdella found new ways to inflict more suffering to his victim.
With Berdella's 4th victim, we've got another development of the behaviour. We've still got electric shocks that he'd used on his previous victim. We've got injection of drugs. We've got sexual assault. And one of the things he uses with this victim is ketamine. Ketamine is a tranquilizer. It is used therapeutically, but it's known that it can cause horrific hallucinations, and it has to be used very carefully in a therapeutic environment. So potentially we're looking at all sorts of horrible hallucinations added to the horrible things that are actually happening to him. It is a horrific set of circumstances that one cannot even really begin to imagine.
Yet again, Berdella documented each and every step in minute detail.
Berdella by now was escalating his torture. Extraordinary things were done to these poor men. And yet again, there was an exact record of what he could survive. I suspect part of the reason for that was that Berdella wanted to see how much a human body could take, what it could accept. He wanted to test everything to its limits. He wanted to see how far. Can he take that? Could he take more?
In less than 24 hours, Walter was dead.
Walter Ferris died at around midnight, the day after he was captured by Robert Berdella. Berdella disposed of Walter's body in the usual fashion, so he dismembered it in his bathtub and he put the pieces of Walter's body out with the trash.
Days after his disappearance, Walter's wife reported him missing to the police.
His wife and mother suspected Berdella because the last time that Walter left the house, he said, "I'm going over to Berdella's," and he was never seen again.
For the second time in approximately 15 months, Berdella was questioned and put under surveillance. But investigators quickly hit a dead end.
The Missing Persons Unit did an investigation. They did their best to further the investigation along, but they were just unsuccessful. There was not enough evidence to charge him. They went to his house. They tried to buy drugs undercover from him. There was various things they did to try to make a case. They were just unsuccessful.
In just over a year, Berdella had detained, savagely tortured and killed 4 men. Each murder he committed increased in brutality as his dark imagination seemed to know no limits. Yet he continued the pretense of an upstanding, if eccentric, member of the local community, and police had no reason to link him with the disappearance of his victims.
The police had no suitable cause to search the house, so as far as they were concerned, Berdella was simply helping the police with their inquiries. They had no concrete evidence whatever against Berdella at that point.
On June the 17th, 1986, Berdella selected his next victim. In the red light district of Kansas City, he picked up 23-year-old casual sex worker and drug addict Todd Stoops.
Berdella's next victim, Todd, had already had contact with him over a number of years. Indeed, had suggested to the police that Berdella might have been guilty of killing his first victim with an injection, which was never proven.
Berdella was sexually attracted to Todd, and Todd and his wife had actually spent some time living in Robert Berdella's house in exchange for sexual favours that Todd provided to Berdella with his wife's knowledge. So this couple, they were very vulnerable, and Berdella took advantage of that vulnerability. When Todd needs money for drugs, Berdella sees another opportunity here.
As soon as Todd stepped foot inside, Berdella began his deadly routine. Over a period of 2 weeks, he subjected him to a ferocious series of attacks.
If what happened to Walter was horrific, he manages to outdo himself with Todd. So we have nearly a fortnight of captivity with torture, whipping, sexual assault again, all sorts of horrific physical acts to degrade, to cause pain. But he's also once again organised. He's planning. He thinks injecting Drano into the eyes will blind his victim, which it does, makes it more difficult to escape. He injects it into the voice box to stop him screaming. These are not the acts of a madman. These are planned, deliberate actions of somebody who knows what he's doing and why he's doing it.
Berdella took extensive photographs of the torture and the demise of Todd. I think Berdella felt that Todd was a significant victim for him. He felt that attraction to him, and it wouldn't surprise me if he'd been at the centre of quite a lot of fantasies he'd had about having a sex slave.
On July the 1st, 1986, Todd died of septic shock from an infection caused by the injuries he had received. Like his previous victims, Berdella dismembered Todd's body and put his remains to be picked up by trash collectors. On the 23rd of June 1987, a little less than a year later, the Kansas City butcher saw his next opportunity.
Larry Pearson was a sex worker who needed some bail bond money. So Robert Berdella says to him, "I will bail you out, I'll give you the money, as long as you come and stay in Ohio for a week with my family." So Larry agrees to do this, and then when they arrive back from this vacation, Berdella takes him captive.
Once again, we have escalation of this behaviour. We started with cruelty It's escalating and escalating. We now have a victim kept for 6 weeks, tortured, sexually assaulted.
Despite the constant torture, Larry fought back.
Larry didn't know what to do. He knew he wanted to survive as best he could, until finally, in what must have been utter despair, Larry bit Berdella's penis during oral sex. The injury to Berdella's penis was so severe he went to hospital.
Berdella calls a taxi, and during the time while he's waiting for the taxi, he kills his victim.
When he's dead, Berdella has the sense to try and keep the property cool, to slow down decomposition, to reduce smells produced. Once again, these are all unconscionable acts, but they are planned, they are deliberately undertaken. This is somebody who is in control of what he's doing.
When Berdella returned from hospital, he dismembered Larry's body.
Berdella was so angry at the injury that had been caused to him that he was determined to take out the maximum punishment and revenge on the man who had the temerity to actually hurt him. It was the first time anyone had tried to hurt him. And so, yet again, he dismembered the body and yet again cut off the head. Only this time he went out into the garden, dug up Robert's head, put Larry's in the same hole, and proceeded to bring Robert's head into the house, clean it up, take the teeth out, put them in 2 envelopes, and put the skull, which was all that remained at that point, into a closet in the upstairs of his house.
Heads are very, very significant for Berdella, and I think the head of Larry is a very important one because this is the guy who has come closest to Berdella's fantasy of having this sex slave. He's the guy who's survived for 6 weeks. He's survived the longest, and I think he wants to commemorate that.
But Berdella's barbarous nature was far from satisfied. On March the 29th, 1988, he picked up 22-year-old male prostitute Christopher Bryson and took him back to his house.
So Christopher Bryson was wandering the streets when Robert Berdella picks him up, and he offers him a beer, and they drive around in his car for a while. Berdella then says, well, come back to my house and you can have a beer there. So Christopher agrees and they go back.
He was brought home to provide sexual favors for Berdella and was told to go upstairs as soon as they got there. As Bryson mounted the stairs and started walking up, he was struck from behind and rendered unconscious.
With his victim sedated and held captive, Berdella began his deadly ritual.
Once again, he is tortured, he is assaulted, he is given bleach in the eyes, but this time it's swabbed onto the eyeballs rather than injected in. That would probably be even more painful. There are many nerve endings on the globe of the eye which would react very badly to the bleach.
Repeatedly electrocuted, raped and injected with a cocktail of sedatives, Christopher remained a submissive captive for 4 days. But on the morning of April the 2nd, 1988, when Berdella had left for work, Christopher managed to set himself free.
He finds some matches and he's able to actually burn through the robes that Berdella had restrained him with. So he flees the house wearing only a dog collar.
He must have been an extraordinary sight, a naked man wearing a dog collar. He runs across the street, meets a meter reader who's going to a house. They knock on the door. The house owner is astonished, opens the door astonished, won't let Christopher into the house, but does call the police.
Roy Orth was a sergeant with the Kansas City Police Department when they received the call.
Chris had been severely physically abused and was asking for help. District officers got there, found this was probably going to be some kind of an unlawful restraint, abduction situation, and called the Sex Crimes Child Abuse Unit, and our detective responded.
Rick Holtzclaw was the assistant prosecutor for the Sex Crimes Unit in Kansas City.
Roy Orth called me and said, "We need you." And I said, "You don't need me today." And he said, "No, I'm telling you, we need you on this one." He may have told me briefly what it was. We had someone who had escaped naked with a dog collar. It became evident that they were going to need some assistance, so I went to the home on that Saturday afternoon, and we began the investigation, getting search warrants, and that's how it began.
In just over a 3-year period, Berdella had held, brutally raped, tortured and killed 6 men and got away with it. Unknown to the police, they were about to uncover the shocking crimes committed by a sadistic serial killer, Robert Berdella. Troy Cole was the lead detective in charge of the case.
I first became aware of him April 2nd, 1988. I was working in the homicide unit. It was a Saturday, and was called out in regards to a sodomy. The guy alleged that he had been kidnapped and held captive for a number of days, and I was the duty sergeant, which meant that I handled the homicides, the robbery, and the sex crimes for that particular day. Christopher managed to escape and flag down a passerby. That's what brought us to the residence.
The traumatized victim recounted his ordeal and gave police the name and address of his captor. When Berdella arrived home that evening, the police were waiting for him.
When Berdella drove up to the house, we asked him for identification, and he produced it. He said, "I live here." And at that point, he was immediately arrested for investigation of sodomy. We brought him downtown. I asked him if he would sign a consent to search the residence so we could further the investigation. He refused. He said that he would rather talk to his attorney. So at that point, we booked him into the city jail and prepared to get a search warrant.
With Chris's testimony, police were able to obtain a warrant to search Berdella's property the same day.
When we first went up to kick the door in, we could hear large dogs in the background, so we called animal control out. Immediate reaction was the house was filthy. Had a stench, the odor was horrible, clutter and dog feces everywhere. It was one of the worst houses I'd ever walked into.
Using the information that Christopher had given them, officers searched Berdella's property for the room where he'd held his victim captive.
So our initial thought was to try to find the room to verify his story. So we go upstairs, and after a brief period of time, we found the room that he had described. We found the bed that he had described, and it had restraints tied to the bedpost. So we were pretty sure at this point his story maybe had some legitimacy to it.
There was a device underneath the bed plugged into the wall that was, it appeared to me to be an electric train transformer. And there were jumper cable clips on the ends of it so that he could attach them to different parts of somebody's body and then increase the electrocution level by turning the transformer selector.
In searching the rest of the house, officers discovered Berdella's most prized collection.
We discovered several hundred, probably 200 to 300 Polaroid photographs that he had taken. Some of the people in the photographs were in obvious signs of being tortured.
Eventually, we were able to find detailed torture notes that Berdella had kept on several people, 6 in fact. And in reviewing those pictures, probably the most telling was one of a young man that was hanging suspended upside down from a steel I-beam in what we later learned was the basement of the Berdella home. And this person appeared to be deceased.
As the police combed the property, they discovered more and more evidence of Berdella's horrific crimes.
A short time later, we found a skull in a closet, which appeared to have been probably fairly recent.
The officers gathered the evidence. The following day, a pathologist was called in.
We had called in a doctor to examine the skull that was in the closet. And he said that in his opinion, that skull probably was less than 2 years old, but it would obviously require further examination. So at that point, we sort of cataloged what we could find in the house that looked like it might have some evidentiary value to it.
One was a bag of what appeared to be human vertebrae that were very clean. Obviously, they'd been boiled out, bleached, almost looked like plastic. We also found a skull that was obviously human and hadn't been bleached out yet.
The police returned to Berdella's home the next day, and they left no stone unturned.
Berdella kept dogs in the backyard in an enclosure. And in looking at the backyard, the grass was noticeably greener in a couple of areas, which caused me to think that, possibly there was something else there.
So at that point, we decided to bring in a backhoe to dig up that one particular spot where it looked like it might have had a grave marker to it.
On the second dig, there was a sucking sound as it dug in and lifted out. I stopped the man immediately and looked, and there was a human jaw that had been pulled up, and then of course we stopped, and eventually we found the full human skull. What it appeared that he was doing was, once he would dismember his victims, he collected the skulls and then would clean them by burying them in the backyard, and after they'd been out there for whatever time he felt was necessary, dig them back up and then clean them out, boil and bleach them.
When police extended their search to Berdella's shop in the bazaar, they found a macabre window display.
As you walked up Westport Road, there was a display of human skulls. I think there were two, I can't remember now. And initially, these were so clean that they appeared to be plastic, but it was later determined that they were also Berdella victims.
Berdella's obsession with his crimes and brazen behavior were his undoing. But the police still had a mammoth task to overcome.
Our biggest challenges early on were identifying all these people that were in the Polaroid photographs. We had no idea when we started the investigation who any of them were. Of the 200, they were not all facial shots. There were some body parts and people in various stages, but we needed to identify the skull that was found in the closet, and we needed to identify the human head that we dug up in the backyard. So those were our biggest challenges.
By May 1988, using Berdella's photos, detailed notes and dental records, the police identified the two skulls as belonging to his second victim, Robert, and his sixth victim, Larry. On August the 3rd, 1988, at Jackson County Circuit Court, Berdella stood before the Circuit Court Judge, Alvin Randall, charged with the first-degree murder of Larry.
The state decide that they're going to pursue a prosecution for the murder of Larry first. But before they get very far, Berdella actually confesses. He pleads guilty.
I think everyone was stunned. Strategically, I think it was a great move on the defense team, because at that time kept the state from filing the death penalty charges against him. Everyone was surprised.
I think he pled guilty because he was scared of the death penalty. And I think he felt like we were going to go for the death penalty. And at that point, he started working out a deal with his attorney to, let's try to cut a deal to save my life.
As the prosecution prepared to take Berdella to trial for the murder of his second victim, Robert, he made a plea bargain.
Part of the guilty plea was that Berdella sat down with his two defense lawyers and then also with Mr. Hall and Mr. Reeder, the prosecutor and the assistant prosecutor from the murder division. And they spent 2 days under oath on the record, and he would lay out what he did to these victims.
From the 13th to the 15th of December, Berdella fully confessed to all 6 murders.
We spent 3 days with him over in the Jackson County Jail, and he was very matter-of-fact in describing all of the murders. Basically, he didn't show any remorse. I think he enjoyed reliving and describing what he had done to the victims. I think he got a charge out of it, and it was a pretty compelling 3 days.
Berdella is incredibly proud of these murders, of this project, of this extended experiment that he's been conducting. And he really does enjoy reliving this and telling people who appear to want to hear about it.
By revealing the true horror of his crimes to the authorities, he avoided the death penalty. On December the 19th, 1988, at Jackson County Circuit Court, Berdella was sentenced.
Berdella receives 2 life sentences for first-degree murder and 4 conditional life sentences for second-degree murder.
But less than 4 years later, on October the 8th, 1992, Berdella died in Missouri State Penitentiary from a heart attack. He was 43. In just over 3 years, he meticulously planned, documented, and implemented the brutal rape, torture, and murder of 6 men. He then cut up their bodies with such methodical precision, he earned the nickname the Kansas City Butcher. The prolonged torture of his victims and his obsession with his own terrifying deeds would make Robert Berdella one of the world's most evil killers. In August 1981, 91-year-old Henry Walsh was held up at knife point in his small hardware store at Ormskirk, Lancashire, in England. The elderly shopkeeper refused to yield to his 18-year-old assailant. He would pay with his life in the most horrific way.
Obviously threatened him with a knife 2 or 3 times. You could see minor marks in his clothing. And then he just pushed it through his chest. And he's actually hanging on it on the door.
The perpetrator was Andrew Dawson, a known local thief who'd suddenly matured into a vicious murderer. He would spend the next 17 years behind bars, but that did nothing to dull his killer instinct.
Almost as inevitably as night follows day, Dawson was going to kill again. It was only a question of when.
Almost 30 years after his first killing, Dawson was a free man with murder on his mind. In 2010, police in Derby would discover 2 of Dawson's neighbours dead, but the convicted killer was nowhere to be found.
This guy kept me awake at night because he just had this feeling that you had to get the evidence. You had to put him away because he was an absolute danger to anybody in society.
Andrew Dawson had proved himself to be one of the world's most evil killers. In July 2011, Andrew Dawson pleaded guilty to the double murder of 2 of his neighbours and was sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. It was the end of the road for the 48-year-old killer who chillingly christened himself the Angel of Mercy. Dawson was no stranger to prison. He'd already served time for murdering a popular shopkeeper in his hometown of Ormskirk in 1981, when he was just 18. Local journalist Clifford Birchall covered the story of the brutal murder in the unassuming town.
Ormskirk in the 80s was just a small country Lancashire town. It had a market that was on the streets twice a week, came alive on those days. It's a small, friendly place. Everybody seemed to know everybody. It was just an ordinary place, just nothing exciting happened very often.
That was all to change in August 1981, when 18-year-old Andrew Dawson entered a small hardware shop owned by popular pensioner Henry Walsh.
From what we learned from the evidence, he'd just gone in, he'd been looking for money, and he thought that Mr. Walsh would be a soft touch. He was, 91 years old. He wouldn't put up much of a fight. He would, do as he was told. But he turned out to have more spirit than Andrew Dawson thought he had. He refused to say where his money was. He refused to help him sort of trying to get him out of the shop, and in the end he paid for it with his life.
After serving 17 years for the crime, Dawson was released in 1999 and settled down in Derby with a wife and 2 children. But just over a decade later, the killer found himself living alone in a flat and his lust for murder returned. Former detective Paul Callum investigated the killing of two of Dawson's neighbours in 2010.
The people that lived in this block of flats and his victims were vulnerable for some reason. Either they're older and they've got ill health or alcohol problems and this sort of thing. And I think Dawson knew that, and he picked on vulnerable people because he knew that he could overpower them and he knew he could control them.
This killer's story begins in the market town of Ormskirk in Lancashire, in the north of England.
Dawson was born in 1962 and he was one of 6 children. The family were quite impoverished, they didn't have a lot of money, so I think times were pretty tough. He did have a very strict and domineering father, but that's nothing out of the ordinary, and his relationship with his mother doesn't seem to have flagged up any concerns either. So his family life wasn't particularly out of the ordinary.
But even from a young age, Dawson displayed signs that he was in for a life of crime.
He grows up in straitened circumstances in Ormskirk. A boy who wants whatever he wants whenever he wants to get it. When he's 6 or 7, he sees a little girl with money, pennies, literally, and steals them because he can, because he feels he can get away with it, because it doesn't matter.
He had a very acute sense of entitlement. If he wanted something, he would just literally go and take it. There were no moral or ethical boundaries there whatsoever. And I don't think that behaviour was ever really challenged. There were never really any serious consequences for that. And if there were, he didn't care. So this was somebody who was psychologically not quite normal.
In my view, Dawson was a sociopath from a very, very early age. He did not know responsibility, he did not know moral values, he did not know conscience, he did not know forgiveness, he did not know saying sorry. Grab it. I'm gonna take it. It's mine. I want it.
The majority of individuals who commit juvenile crime, petty or otherwise, usually turn themselves around as they mature out of it. The younger someone is when they begin their criminal behavior, the worse the prognosis is, the worse the outcome is. And so when you look at Dawson's background, what stands out to me from a distance is he was involved in crime right from the beginning. He was a problem child right from the start.
As Dawson matured, so did his crimes.
As a teenager, Dawson engaged in property crime. He committed a range of petty thefts, and the victims he would target would be elderly people. And I think he was quite aware of the vulnerability of the elderly, of the fact that they might keep money in their houses or their workplaces.
The burgeoning criminal was soon on the radar of the local authorities.
Andrew Dawson had come to the attention of the police in the past through just petty theft. He was known to them. I don't think they thought he was one of the great criminals of the town, but he was just perhaps more a nuisance than anything else.
There appeared to be nothing obvious in Dawson's young life that justified his criminality.
He had 5 siblings. They're not all committing crimes and killing people. No, it was Dawson. He's the only one. He grew up in the same family with them. The parents treated them, generally speaking, the same according to all the other family members. No, it was Dawson. It's within him. It wasn't an event that happened that created him. It's who he was.
I think there was very much a sense of competition between Dawson and his siblings. There's always that vying for attention, and there are 6 of them. So I think that they're always trying to outdo each other. And that's the case in many large families. But I think Dawson took it a little bit further than most. He had a significantly antagonistic relationship with his brother. He stole money from his brother.
It was the final straw. Dawson's brother reported him to the police, and the young criminal was arrested and charged with theft.
It was enough to have him sent to Borstal for about 6 months. And then sort of when he was released, he came back to Ormskirk, and obviously, hadn't really learnt from his ways. He just carried on as he had before.
Somebody like Dawson and other extraordinary offenders, who particularly those who commit multiple crimes, they see the world differently.
than the average person. They function in a different sphere. And so where punishment may help somebody straighten themselves out and get on the right track, for somebody like Dawson, it has no effect at all. It just serves as an irritant for him, just makes him angry because he wants to do what he wants to do. That's who he is.
By the age of 18, Andrew Dawson was already a veteran thief, and his time in the youth prison nicknamed Borstal had not curbed his criminal ways. But in August 1981, his life of petty crime would take an even darker turn.
Henry Walsh had been a shopkeeper in the town for a long time. He was an ironmonger. His shop didn't carry a lot of stock, but it was stuff he couldn't find anywhere else. It was sort of a time warp in some ways. He was just a lovable old character.
At some point late on Thursday the 13th of August, Andrew Dawson entered Henry Walsh's shop. By the following morning, locals were concerned for the whereabouts of the 91-year-old.
Mr. Walsh hadn't been seen on the Friday, which was unusual, and somebody was going past noticed that two big gates which guarded the alley to the rear of the premises, they hadn't been closed all night, and his back door was open, which was unusual.
The passer-by dialed 999, and in a matter of moments, Detective Jim Kay arrived at the scene.
I was driving through the town, and the call came over the radio that this back door of the shop was open, and there was no sign of the shopkeeper. So I just turned around the corner. It was a matter of 20 yards, and went into the shop with another officer who arrived. He arrived and I said, just follow me in. You're walking through expecting to find the old man somewhere, maybe collapsed. And to see this man hung on the door is a little bit frightening.
91-year-old Henry Walsh had been hung from coat hooks on the back of a door, tortured and then brutally stabbed to death with a carving knife. It wouldn't be long before news of the beloved elderly man found viciously murdered in his own hardware store got out. It would send shockwaves across the quiet town of Ormskirk, England.
I was in Moore Street, which is one of the main shopping streets, and about 250 yards away at the other end of Moore Street, I could see some unusual police activity. I could see a policeman standing where a policeman wouldn't normally stand, and he wasn't moving. So he was obviously guarding something, so I just acted on my reporter's instinct that something was wrong. So I sort of got there and sort of made some inquiries and ascertained that there had been a suspicious death, and it was Mr. Walsh. So I arranged for a photographer to come out and take a picture that we used in the paper of the police on the scene outside the shop.
Henry Walsh was a nice man. You know, one who I spoke to every time I passed. He would come to the door and say, good afternoon, good morning, and a very pleasant old man.
He was just a really lovable person, and you just couldn't imagine anybody who would have it in them to kill him, to be honest.
News of the 91-year-old's horrific death began reaching the locals. The nature of the crime was unthinkable.
He'd been stabbed with a knife, been stabbed in the chest several times, but he'd also been hung up at the back of a door on some coat hooks, and the last wound, the knife had gone straight through him and embedded itself in the back of the door. It also tied a ligature around his neck, presumably as a way to try and force some information out of him.
The police didn't know it yet, but the killer was an 18-year-old thief named Andrew Dawson, who had seemingly revelled in his first murder.
Dawson didn't just simply kill Henry Walsh. He made this victim suffer. He stabbed him multiple times. Some of the wounds were quite shallow, which is indicative of a torture, of saying, actually, I have power over you, I am in control, and enjoying the reaction of his victim to that. And he hung Henry up on the back of a door. So he's displaying his victim. He's saying, hey, everybody, look at what I've done. Look at what I can accomplish.
You have to ask yourself, What is it that provokes an 18-year-old to kill him, to repeatedly stab him, to pose him, and to leave him? There is something very, very depraved about that. There is something monstrous.
I don't see him targeting a truck driver, a 25-year-old truck driver out there. Well, why isn't he targeting that guy? That guy could have money too. He just made his deliveries. No, Dawson's way too smart for that. He targets somebody old and weak and vulnerable that he knows he can get over on. That's who Dawson is.
Dawson had killed a man 73 years his senior for nothing more than the day's takings from the till and the 91-year-old's pension book.
When police conducted a search of the house later on, they found out that Mr. Walsh did what most old people in those days did. They'd hidden money in and around rooms in the house, and I think they collected about £1,800 in cash, which was, you know, quite a lot of money in those days. But I think Andrew Dawson had tried to get him to say where it was, but he refused, which I think perhaps accounts for the ferocity of his attack in the end.
He'd be frightened to death. He was a very timid old man. Not the type of man who'd look for trouble or get involved in trouble. He's only picked on because he was an old man. He wouldn't fight back. I wouldn't have thought.
After taking the life of another man for the very first time, Dawson didn't panic or attempt to flee Ormskirk. Instead, the cocky 18-year-old flaunted his newly acquired riches.
Now, everybody knows he's got no money. And he goes to a pub, a local pub, where he's seen, all of a sudden, feeding lots of coins into the fruit machine. Well, that's rather odd, rather strange. They're immediately going to say, where did you get the money from? It is unbelievably foolish.
He was somebody who was perpetually broke, so this was something that was rather unusual, and that the police eventually catch up with him. And it emerged that Dawson had actually cashed in Henry's pension book for £50 in the days following the murder.
Once Andrew Dawson was arrested, sort of people, in some ways they weren't surprised because they knew he did have a reputation, but I think they were sort of shocked that he could have done such a savage act.
At Preston Crown Court on the 10th of March 1982, Andrew Dawson pleaded guilty to the murder of Henry Walsh. He had told police that he panicked after the 91-year-old had recognised him. In a statement, Dawson said, "I am sorry for what I have done. I had no intention to cause anybody any harm. I wish it was me and not him."
The judge at the Crown Court gave credence to Andrew Dawson's guilty plea, and also the fact that he seemed remorseful to some extent. He was said to have told the police, you know, "I wish it had been me, not him." So the judge did give credence and mentioned this when she was passing sentence.
I'm not convinced by this whatsoever. We've got to remember that this was a young man who'd done a stint in Borstal. He was quite familiar with the types of things that he needed to say to get sympathy, to get attention, and to secure the best outcome for himself.
Dawson, aged just 19 years old, was jailed for life. He had graduated from Borstal to prison, adding murder to his rap sheet.
The mood after a murder trial, it's not exactly one where you say people would glad that a sentence being carried out, but I think more one of relief that, you know, sort of justice had been seen to be done, and sort of the fact that the right thing had happened and people were now happy and sort of they were sort of content that the wrongdoing had been punished.
Dawson spent the next 17 years of his life behind bars, but during his time inside, he was no shrinking violet. He reportedly commented on serial killers Peter Sutcliffe and Dennis Nielsen, labelling them as wimps and claiming to be a better man.
When he was in prison, he was comparing himself to other notorious offenders. That's a bad sign. Anytime an offender wants to compare himself to other notorious killers, that's a huge red flag. A sign of rehabilitation is you want to put that part of your life away. You want to show how you're different than other people, not how that you're more extraordinary than some of these notorious people. That's a huge red flag.
In early 1999, Andrew Dawson was deemed ready for release from Sudbury Prison in Derbyshire. Still just 36 years old, it was a chance for him to start a new life.
After his release from prison, Andrew Dawson appeared to have turned over a new leaf. He'd moved to a different area, Derby. He'd met a woman, he'd settled down with her, and they had 2 children together. And from the outside, he appears to be a regular guy. But this was not to last, because Andrew Dawson is a person who is prone to boredom. He has that need for stimulation. He has that hedonistic streak to him. So he starts drinking, and that leads to the breakdown of his marriage.
He's matured now, he's older, maybe he's a different person. But it wasn't long before Dawson reverted to who he was.
Over the next decade, Dawson would continually breach the conditions of his release.
In that period between his divorce in 2003 and 2010, Dawson bumps into the law and is returned to prison on a regular basis 3 times. He's drunk and disorderly, he's violent. He isn't in any kind of control, and he's constantly, therefore, because he's out on licence for the original life sentence, straight back to jail. Almost as inevitably as night follows day, Dawson was going to kill again. It was only a question of when.
By July 2010, Andrew Dawson was estranged from his wife with limited access to his children. He lived alone in a 1-bedroom flat on Waterford Drive just outside of Derby. Former detective Paul Callum worked on the investigation into the sudden death of one of Dawson's neighbours, 66-year-old John David Matthews.
The initial police incident came in at 7 p.m. on the Sunday the 25th of July. Mr. Matthews worked at a local restaurant, and staff at the restaurant had been worried that he'd not turned up for work in the previous week or so. And police officers were called to the flat, and they forced entry, and they found Mr. Matthews' body in the bath downstairs. They looked at Mr. Matthews' body, and unfortunately, because they think he'd been there for a couple of weeks, there was quite a lot of decomposition. And at that time, the incident was recorded as potential suicide.
But the post-mortem told a different story.
Late in the afternoon of Wednesday the 28th of July, I had a phone call from the coroner's office to say that the local pathologist had started the post-mortem of Mr. Matthews, and that he said that there was what he believed were stab wounds.
It was clear this was not a suicide, it was in fact murder. The killer had done his best to cover up the murder.
What he'd done at the crime scene with Mr. Matthews is that after stabbing him, he'd redressed him. So he'd got rid of the shirt that had the stab wounds through it and put a shirt that didn't have any marks on it. He completely changed all his clothing and then put him into the bath. We started doing some early inquiries, and one of those was, what do we have on the electoral register? Who lives there? What intelligence do we have about the block of flats?
Detectives immediately singled out convicted killer Andrew Dawson as a potential suspect.
It very quickly became obvious that Andrew Dawson was going to be our suspect. He had convictions for murder, and he was on licence, and there was some history of a recent assault with somebody else at a previous flat that he'd lived at. So it was reasonably obvious that he was going to be our main focus quite early on. We wanted to secure the scene at Dawson's house, and then obviously our biggest priority was finding out where was Dawson right now.
Whilst detectives launched a manhunt, investigators forced entry into Dawson's flat.
The flat was completely empty, apart from a few items of clothing, but what was particularly interesting about Dawson's flat was it smelt of bleach, and it was very, very clean.
Andrew Dawson was nowhere to be found. He was on the run and presumed to be very dangerous.
We were extremely worried. We obviously knew that a murder had happened at some point before the Sunday the 25th, And looking at the decomposition, we think probably up to 2 weeks before that. So we had nearly a 3-week time period where we had no idea where Dawson had been.
John David Matthews, who was known as Dave, had actually been killed on the 10th of July, stabbed 18 times by his seemingly friendly neighbour, Andrew Dawson, who often popped over to use the washing machine.
Dawson arrives at his door with the conventional excuse that he used many times in the block. Can I use your washing machine because mine's broken? Dave lets him in, not suspecting anything. Imagine what must have gone through Dave Matthews' mind. It would have been indescribable, terrifying, reduced him to absolute fear in an instant, and yet there was nothing he could do. Nothing he could do to protect himself against a man who'd come there to kill him, and to kill him for reasons entirely of his own. This was not a motive of greed. This was a motive of the desire to kill.
After Dawson had killed David and left his body in the bath, he actually left the flat because this was the day when he was looking after his children, and he took them out for the day as if nothing had ever happened, and he returned the next day and cleaned up the crime scene and got rid of the blood. Now, for somebody to be able to do this, to be able to function as normal after committing a murder, is something that is very, very rare. I've met a lot of people convicted of murder, and their behaviour in the aftermath is very rarely normal because they're so shocked at the enormity of what they've done that they're unable to function with any degree of normality.
The crime had affected the whole community. As the search for the convicted killer continued, detectives questioned the other neighbours at Waterford Drive. One neighbour even told a story to police of how the killer had been involved in an altercation in his flat.
A resident started telling the investigating officer that had sat down with him to take his statement about the relationship with Dawson, and that they used to walk in each other's flats and this sort of thing.
The neighbour went on to describe an incident which had occurred just days before. After inviting Dawson in for a drink, he caught him rifling through his drawers. The neighbour confronted him and Dawson turned nasty.
He was grabbed from behind with an arm around his neck, and he felt something in his sort of lower abdomen. He'd sort of thrown Dawson off. Dawson made light of it and said he was just mucking around and this sort of thing. And again, at the time, he didn't particularly think anything of this, but we now know when you listen to the account and you know what Dawson was capable of, that it was likely that he was going to be his first victim.
I think that's only further evidence of the fact that in this small block in Chaddeston, not a lot of flats, that Dawson was by now out of control, completely and utterly out of control. He would attack anyone, driven by his own desire to kill.
On the morning of the 30th of July, detectives received news that Dawson had been spotted in Whitehaven, Cumbria, over 200 miles away from Derby. While local police began to search for the killer, investigations were continuing at the flats. Detectives had accounted for all of Dawson's neighbours, apart from one, 58-year-old Paul Hancock.
So at about 7:30, 8 o'clock, while I was doing the briefing, we got one of the detective sergeants stood at the back of the room and was waving at me, and she came across and whispered to me and said they found another body, and that the officers that were doing the house-to-house inquiries had forced entry to Mr. Hancock's flat and had found him, and he'd also been murdered. We finished the briefing and it started again, and this is when you started to really feel concerned that what had Dawson been doing in that 3-week period that we couldn't account for, and had he killed anybody else?
How many more bodies might turn up at Waterford Drive? It was a frightening thought for the investigators, and they soon had information that revealed the killer had been in the building on the very same day the body of Dave Matthews was discovered.
It turns out on the Sunday afternoon, the call came in about Mr. Matthews. The police had arrived at the flat, and this came out with subsequent inquiries, but it turned out that Dawson was actually upstairs in Hancock's flat when the police arrived. Now, it's possible that he had just committed the murder at that point, or he may have committed the murder over the previous few days and he was there starting to clean up, but we will never really know. But what we do know is that Dawson was in Mr. Hancock's flat when the police arrived. He came downstairs, he spoke to one of the special constables that was there, and he was asked had he seen Mr. Matthews, and he spoke to the police and said that, oh no, he doesn't know him very well, he hasn't seen very much of him. And we then know that within about 10 minutes he'd packed his bag, he'd ordered a taxi, and he'd left the house and had gone to the train station.
Unbeknownst to the police, they had stood face to face with the killer. Since that moment, Andrew Dawson had been on the run for 5 days. But now local police in Whitehaven had located him and were ready to make an arrest.
A uniformed constable comes across Andrew Dawson sleeping on a bench on the seafront in Whitehaven. He might almost have had a sign on his chest saying, "I'm Andrew Dawson and you really want to look at me because I killed 2 people in Derby."
But the police had to proceed with care. They were dealing with a serial killer. Armed with 7 knives in his backpack, Dawson had no intention of giving himself up.
Dawson appeared to want the police to shoot him. He wanted to go down in a blaze of glory and basically occupy a lot of headlines. There's a real kind of dramatic element to this perpetrator. And shortly after he was arrested, he jumped into the sea and he started to swim away. And it really is quite incredible, the behaviour of this man. He soon realised, actually, this probably isn't a good idea, I'm not getting anywhere, and then swam back to shore where the police caught up with him again. It's an attempt at being dramatic. It's an attempt at trying to create this kind of feared persona, but it's one that always falls flat on its face for Dawson.
Dawson is tasered rather than shot. I'm sure he was very upset by that. I'm sure he would much rather that armed response unit had turned up and given him the glory that he wanted.
With Dawson safely in custody, investigators could begin to delve deeper into the 47-year-old killer. After his dramatic arrest in Whitehaven, Cumbria, he'd been brought back down to Derbyshire to be questioned on suspicion of the murders of his neighbours, Dave Matthews and Paul Hancock. The bodies of both victims had been bathed in bleach to hide any forensic evidence. Detectives would have to use all their skills to prove that Andrew Dawson had killed again.
In terms of an investigation, normally you have sort of 36 hours of real urgent work to do, because you have to either get enough evidence to charge somebody or you have to release them. Because he was on parole and because of the nature of this, actually from an investigator's point of view, it made the job a little bit easier because we could recall him to prison, and actually we had a lot of time to make sure that we could get the evidence together and get the case together, which was just as well, because despite it feeling like it was obviously him, you've got to get the evidence to prove that. And forensically, it was very, very challenging.
On the same day of Dawson's arrest, police had discovered the body of 58-year-old Paul Hancock. Just like his neighbour Dave Matthews, Paul had been found stabbed to death in his own bathtub.
With Mr. Matthews, the flat had been cleaned. There was a lot of bleach poured into the bath. It had clearly been tidied up. And with Mr. Hancock's, it was very dishevelled. It had been very rushed. There was clothing in the bath, there was weapons in the bath, there was all sorts of bits of gloves, marigold gloves and this sort of thing. All the drawers had been through the house, and we know that money was stolen and various other items. And apart from the fact that there was bodies in the bath and they'd been stabbed, the two scenes were totally different.
It's believed that Dawson was still cleaning up the crime scene when the police had discovered the body of Dave Matthews across the hall. Dawson likely panicked and threw his clothes into the bath of bleach to kill any forensic evidence.
On the yellow trousers that he was wearing, there was a slash mark on the right-hand side, on the right leg. Dawson also had an injury to his right leg, and it's impossible to actually match that to the injury, but again, it's very likely that he was wearing those trousers when he committed the murder. So he's very forensically aware, so I think he had a system, he had a type of clothing that he wore to make sure that he doesn't get contaminated with blood, and then he went and commits the murders, and then he bleaches them and gets rid of any evidence.
Bleach indicates forensic awareness. Bleach is one of those things that wipes up a great deal of forensic evidence. Dawson's been a career criminal. He's been in prison his entire life. He knows what bleach does. He was in the juvenile center, but he also went to state prison. That's like graduate school for crime. All criminals do all day is talk about their crimes and how they got caught and this and that and how to avoid law enforcement. So the fact that he used bleach doesn't surprise me at all. It just reflects what he learned in prison and how to try to avoid detection.
With Dawson being held in custody indefinitely, it gave detectives more time to study the crime scene at Dave Matthews' flat.
When we first searched Mr. Matthews' house, there was a few items that we didn't really understand. One of them was a rose that was on the pillow in Mr. Matthews' bedroom, and it was just an old red rose. The other thing was, when we searched Dawson's flat, there was a blank notepad. But you could see indentations on it.
This suggested that a note had been written on the sheet of paper above. If experts could decipher the faint indentations, it could be a huge clue.
About 3 weeks after that inquiry had been sent off, I got a phone call from our forensic team, really excited. And they said, they were saying, "Boss, this is amazing, this is fantastic. We've got a confession." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And it turned out that he'd written a letter to the police. It was to the head of homicide, it said. And he wrote this poem, very badly spelled, but the poem talked about in a bath in Waterford Drive, there lies a man, and he talked about, if in 2 weeks' time you don't know about it, I will come and report it to the police. And he talked about the rose being the nice touch, and he signed it, the Angel of Mercy. Really, really chilling, but very, very important key bit of evidence.
Dawson had signed the note with a chilling moniker.
The confession letter that police had come across had been signed the Angel of Mercy, and I think this is really testament to Andrew Dawson's narcissism. He wanted a brand, he wanted an identity, he wanted infamy, and I think this was very much part of that. He wants that recognition for the things that he's done.
He's pretending to be significant. He's not. He's an insignificant, horrid, horrible, depraved, monstrous killer, but not in his mind.
As investigations continued, more evidence was uncovered at Dave Matthews' flat.
In Mr. Matthews' house, there was very, very little forensic evidence in there, in terms of fingerprints, DNA, and this sort of thing. He had destroyed most of the evidence, but we found a marigold glove in the bath that had the thumb missing on it. And part of the forensic strategy was to find this piece of rubber from the thumb.
Paul knew that finding the tip of the glove may finally yield some forensic evidence.
So the whole house was completely emptied. We spent weeks there, meticulously going through everything in the lounge, and the scenes of crime team found the tip of the marigold glove. And we think that it probably got caught in a drawer while he was stealing property from the flat, and it had snapped off. And in this small piece of the thumb, and it was the tiny piece of the thumb there, they managed to recover some DNA, which proved that it was Andrew Dawson, which was a very, very significant piece of evidence because forensically we had very, very little. There was a lot of circumstantial evidence, but little forensic evidence.
In total, 5,000 items were seized from the flats at Waterford Drive. However, only one of these provided the conclusive forensic evidence investigators needed. This new discovery undoubtedly connected Dawson with the murder of Paul Hancock. In interviews with investigators, Andrew Dawson initially confessed to both murders.
He talked about Mr. Matthews being a nice man. He talked about how he didn't really want to kill him, but he just felt that he had to, and he had an urge to do it. And this was what's particularly chilling and very frightening about Mr. Dawson. There didn't seem to be any particular motive other than a desire to kill somebody. So in that respect, you tell me someone's mental state, that's quite worrying. Certainly, I dealt with a lot of murder inquiries for all sorts of different reasons. But to have somebody that said they just had an urge to do it is very, very frightening.
By the time of his court hearing in July 2011, Dawson had changed his story. denying the murders and pleading not guilty. But he didn't hide behind his lies for long.
You saw it in court. He was very, very impatient. He didn't like to wait around. He liked a very impetuous sort of character. For example, at court, he pleaded not guilty, and after a couple of hours, he looked like he got bored, and he had a word with his solicitor and just said, "Oh, I can't be bothered. I'll plead guilty," you know, and that was the court case, and that was kind of the way I think he was.
This is a tactic that we see with a lot of offenders like Dawson. They enjoy playing with people, they enjoy manipulating people, they enjoy having everybody running around, sorting things out, and then they chuck a grenade in and cause chaos. And I think that's exactly what he was doing here.
In total, Andrew Dawson stabbed Dave Matthews 18 times and Paul Hancock 22 times. He had received a fairly lenient sentence after his first murder in Ormskirk in 1981. But there would be no similar result for him this time.
The judge, Mrs. Justice Dobbs, gave Dawson a whole life tariff. Life will mean life in your case. She told Dawson in sentencing, these were premeditated and planned, brutal killings. Each had the misfortune of being your neighbour who had no chance.
Relief, I think, more than anything. But there wasn't, you know, there's no particular reason to sort of celebrate or anything like that. It's just, you know, really sad for the victims of the family. These were both victims were just, you know, regular people that were trying to live their life and hadn't particularly upset anybody. In fact, both have been described as very pleasant people that just sort of kept themselves to themselves. So very, very sad.
Andrew Dawson remains in prison and will never be released. Some experts believe that he was never rehabilitated after his first murder conviction and should never have been in a position to be able to kill 2 more innocent victims.
For me, what makes this case exceptional is the failure to realise how serious the first murder was. It was interpreted as a homicide during the course of a robbery, but actually it was much, much worse than that. This individual had been tortured, essentially. The time that the perpetrator had spent with the victim was quite significant, and the perpetrator was only 18 years old. So I think this was a massive red flag for further potential violence, and even though he was convicted of murder, there was not enough work done to address what led to that.
I think that there is a case that sort of some people are so dangerous that they can't be allowed out of prison. It seems a harsh thing to condemn somebody to die in prison, but sort of I think some people, you know, never learn and never alter. I think it's one of those things that sort of sometimes you have to do it. And this is, you know, probably one of those cases.
Dawson was a selfish killer who had no regard for his victims. The only reason he's ever given for his horrific crimes is that he had an urge to kill.
When we look at the crimes of Andrew Dawson, they are so horrendous that many people say this could only be the workings of a madman. But unfortunately, they're not. This is an individual who knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that what they were doing was wrong, and they carried on doing it anyway.
It's conventional to talk about serial killers as having a trigger. Sometimes it's in their childhood, sometimes it's a moment in their adolescence. I don't believe there was such a trigger to Andrew Dawson. I think there was something in him from the very beginning that led him to commit these heinous crimes.
I dealt with a lot of suspicious deaths and a lot of murder inquiries. There weren't many that kept me awake at night. This guy kept me awake at night because you just had this feeling that you had to get the evidence. You had to put him away because he was an absolute danger to anybody in society. I think this idea that you can suddenly get an urge to kill someone clearly makes you extremely dangerous, doesn't it?
Dawson is a killer who murdered innocent people for his own depraved enjoyment. He may have started out as a petty thief, but that was an unlawful livelihood that didn't satiate his urges. He needed something more to satisfy his twisted mind. His lust for murder and the pleasure he gets from it are what makes Andrew Dawson one of the world's most evil killers.